to the Reclaim app, where we're creating safe spaces of connection with God, each other, and ourselves. Hello, friends. We're grateful to have you with us for our final episode of our Advent series. As we've journeyed together over the past 4 weeks, we've talked about the painful and uncomfortable space of loneliness, and we've looked at the other side of loneliness, solitude, which is being alone with God. Then last week, we took a deep dive into grief, where Liz and I shared how grief has been felt and known in our own stories. And today, we're going to close this series by looking at the emotion of joy and reflect on where joy shows up in our stories, even in some of the most surprising places. Now, listening to Liz and I talk about joy this week may feel like a welcomed break from some of the harder stuff we've been sharing. During the season of Advent, joy is an important part of our waiting and anticipation for Jesus' coming to restore, to heal, to save. However, if we're honest, joy may not be as easy to cultivate or as comfortable as we'd like it to be or think it should be. Joy can often feel fleeting and imaginary. Even in the midst of some of our most joyous moments, we can find ourselves cautiously waiting for the other shoe to drop. Brené Brown names this foreboding joy and notes that her research confirms it's a universal emotion, but we rarely talk about it because we often think we're the only ones who feel this way, like there's something wrong with me if I can't experience joy. So we're going to unpack this beautiful and yet difficult emotion and see if we can point to the ways we may be able to anchor our joy in something real, tangible, and long-lasting. Sound good?
Mm-hmm.
Now, just quickly before we do that, we wanted to let you know that over the next 2 weeks, as Liz and I take some time to be with family and friends over the Christmas break, our podcast time will look a bit different. I'll be sharing a short Christmas message next Sunday and then a New Year's message on January 1st. And then Liz and I will be back with a new podcast series where we'll be looking at how we can create space for rhythms in our everyday lives as we enter this new year.
You know, Carrie, when I hear the word rhythm, what immediately comes to mind is music and dance. Music has like a soul or a pulse to it, and each human connects so uniquely to that pulse. Dance is movement. Sometimes it's this 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 repeated pattern, especially when we're first learning to be a little more comfortable in our bodies as we're learning to dance for the first time. So there's this like formulaic response, which eventually can become second nature. Other times, music may awaken something which invites spontaneity, which is like a more free-flowing, but no less purposeful response than the waltz or, like the Macarena may invoke. So what Carrie and I want to explore together as this new year unfolds is how spiritual rhythms, which are those habits and practices which support deepening intimacy and connection with God, ourself, and others, can align with the unique season of the soul we're in. So the practices Carrie may find help her listen more intently to her life will most likely look different than the practices which help me listen to mine. So when we recognize each of us is in different places in our spiritual journeys, that tendency to compare and contrast will begin to die off, and we can then more fully listen to God's voice in our stories while learning from one another. So stay tuned for that.
Great analogy, Liz. Yes, please join us in the new year as we dance our way through spiritual rhythms. Okay, now let's talk about joy. Last week, when we looked at grief, we also noted that in order to experience healing from our grief, we need to be able to express it, to mourn. Often in our times of grief, these painful emotions are expressed through tears. And last week we were reminded that even Jesus wept. And when Jesus weeps, we see him expressing deep compassion, validating our humanity, as well as giving us permission to process our own emotions, which is a necessity as it moves us towards healing and even transformation. And it's this strange tension that we often find ourselves living in, of being sorrowful and yet always rejoicing, feeling joy even in spaces of pain. And it's this strange tension that we're going to talk about today as we look at the idea of joy in darkness. Now, when we hear the word joy, we may be tempted to equate joy with happiness, but there is a difference. Liz, it's my understanding that happiness is an emotion of joy, and it's primarily based on our external circumstances. For example, it's easy to be happy when you have freedom from suffering, or you're financially secure, or all your relationships are good. But when we find ourselves having troubles with one or more of these things, typically the feeling of being happy fades quite quickly. And while happiness is dependent on external circumstances, joy is not. Rather, joy is consistent and cultivated internally. It has to do with the state of our spirit, our heart, and soul. Does that line up with your understanding and definitions around this emotion, Liz?
Yeah, I would say it does, Carrie, because I've learned that joy isn't grounded in the measure of pleasure I feel in my body. I want to say our emotions are not irrational, but they do shift throughout the day and to varying degrees of intensity. So if joy were to be based solely on this measurement standard, it would be a fleeting experience when we are in the thick of it in our stories, and all we seem to feel is grief and sorrow, or that depressed state, or even what the poet St. John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul, your hope deferred season. So I want to say, Carrie and I actually recorded this episode a couple of days ago, and today is Monday. So we recorded it Friday. We had a great time doing this podcast, but then Carrie called me later Friday night to let me know, oh no, Liz, the sound didn't go through quite the way we thought it would. And so she wanted to know if we could re-record it, which of course we set up the time today to do it. But what ended up happening is that I took time out on the Saturday to tell God, God, I am so tired. I don't want to do this all over again. I have so much to do and catch up on. But what actually shifted is that I chose to be honest with God, but also said, I wonder in the midst of my fatigue and tiredness, and I know Carrie was feeling that too, talking about our grief stories, I wonder if there is a gift in this inconvenience. I'm feeling frustrated and fatigued, and I'm going to honor that's how I'm feeling. But I also didn't want to camp out in that emotion and those emotions and miss out on something God had for us in this inconvenience. So again, while emotions aren't irrational, they're not necessarily always aligned with truth, fact, or rationale. They could be fueled by our opinions, lies, or even irrational thought. So I can feel grief, sad, and sorrow, but if I'm not listening to what the sorrow is connected with, I can choose to only feel what I'm feeling and just tell myself this sucks, this isn't fair, and just live from that narrative, missing out on a greater gift God may have in the uncomfortable. It's interesting. I heard a pastor say this week, your feelings don't care about your future. Your feelings just want to be met right now. So while we want to be present to what is happening right now, we also want to be mindful that we do not live from a narrative that says our emotions can have full access to the driver's seat in our stories, and we'll just choose how to live based on our feelings alone. So again, emotions are important and they do communicate our humanity, but in and of themselves, they cannot ground and sustain us, especially in times of great difficulty and challenge. So I want to shift to this picture from the movie Pixar's Inside Out, which came out in 2015. In this film, we go on a journey into the emotional brain of 11-year-old Riley. As we get to know Riley in her growing up years, we get a little look-see into her brain circuitry and get a front row education into how the emotions joy, sadness, anger, disgust, and fear came to be attached to her core memories. So as Riley grows up, and just like each of us, she is exposed to a continuous influx of information through her everyday life experiences. The development of her information processing skills as it ties in with memory during her early childhood is creatively symbolized in the film through the visual use of marbles. So for example, if Riley plays hockey, her emotional response of, say, joy, if that's her experience, colors the marble associated with that particular experience with the color for joy. While I'm mentioning this in relationship to grief, which is a sad emotion, and our theme today of joy, is the experiences each of us have had throughout our lives are connected with emotional responses. But it doesn't follow that how I respond to an event and how, say, Carrie might respond to the same event will awaken the exact same emotional response. Riley may have equated playing sports with joy, but someone else may equate playing sports with fear. Upon hearing of the death of a parent, one person may experience heartbroken, another may experience disgust. So what I want to say is biblical joy is grounded in who Jesus is and not our life situations and circumstances. Henry Nouwen, who I am going to reference a few times in today's episode, says joy is the experience of knowing that you are unconditionally loved and that nothing, whether it's sickness, failure, emotional distress, oppression, war, or even death, can take that love away. This is like Romans 8 confidence. We are more than conquerors through him who loves us. Our grief and sorrow do not have the final say in our stories unless we let them. What is beautiful about this definition is that I can feel my grief and sorrow, and I can know that this is okay because it's not about pushing sadness away so I can chase after some arbitrary measure of what I think happiness might feel like. When the source of joy and foundation of my life are in Jesus, I can experience the different nuances and textures of grief without getting swallowed by them because I'm being held by my God who carries me.
Oh, Liz, I love that movie. And it's such a great example of this tension. And spoiler alert.
There's always one.
Yes. At the end of the movie, we actually see sadness and joy come together. And we're told they're not meant to be separate. And although there is still sadness in Riley's story, we see that joy is present in the loving embrace of another, in this case, her parents. And it's just such a beautiful marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Liz, in our last episode, we both shared how we've lost our loved ones and what our grief journey looked like in that particular space. As you and I have shared our stories with one another as friends and in preparation for our podcast, we have found a deep connection in our stories in that we were both with our loved ones at the end of their life. Perhaps surprising and comforting to me is that we have both described that time as something extremely difficult and yet not without spaces of beauty and, dare I say, joy. Would you mind expanding on this tension that we often find ourselves living in, experiencing grief and a lot of the other hard emotions, while also being joyful? It's such a paradox.
Paradox, that is the word, Carrie. Yeah, as I reflect back on my mom's story of cancer and her death, a tension which came to mind in my preparation was that idea of like learning to be present with myself in my individual grief, while also being present with others in this idea of collective grief. I didn't always know what I was feeling or where I was at as my mom's cancer journey spread out over a 10-year span. And in the midst of that, included all my own personal life transitions and stuff outside of her cancer journey. While I do have much more grace for humans in this area, I did notice early on not everyone could sit with me without making it about themselves. If I have a pet peeve, Carrie, and full admittance, this is a pet peeve of mine, it's when someone determines what I am thinking and feeling without taking a moment to simply ask me. So one example which stands out is being told I was in denial and needed to start thinking more about my mom's death when I had not sensed in those early days of my mom's diagnosis she was going to die soon. Having other people give me their opinions and communicate as though what they were saying was factual was not easy when there were days I wasn't always sure what I was thinking and feeling. So sometimes I would question God's voice or how I was feeling because someone told me I was in denial. I also had a long struggle with pushing down what I was feeling because of a narrative that I had to put others first, or that other people had it worse than I did, which only further separated me from being more honest with myself, with God, and of course, other people. It can get messy. So I want to say this out loud. There is a time to think about things like the war going on in Europe right now, or starving children, or lack of access to clean drinking water, or the people in your neighborhood who are really struggling. So it does help us to look outside of ourselves and can actually give us a renewed perspective on our own pain and suffering. But when you push your stuff down and say, I can't struggle with pain or whatever you're going through because others have it worse, you're actually denying yourself access to the parts of your life which would enable you to enter more fully and compassionately into the pain of others. One clear example which comes to mind is when I was youth pastor and about 2 months after my mom died, one of our 12-year-old youth died by suicide. So horrible and so terrible. The old narrative in my head would have been, this family has it worse because at least my mom died by natural causes, which would have been me trying to push my stuff down in order to be present to this grieving family. What actually helped me recognize this is not helpful is someone outside of myself, a pastor on staff, came to me and asked me how I was feeling about helping the deceased family grieve and prepare for the funeral. I was able to recognize their grief and my grief are different, not better and not worse, just different. So this actually enabled me to enter into their grief without hiding or burying my own grief or actually making it all about myself. So how I entered more fully in my unique individual grief was beginning to release people from the idea that they had to fully enter my story and fully understand where I was at. It's not to ever excuse unhealthy human behavior, Carrie, but I don't even fully know myself. Why would I expect a fellow human being to fully know what I am going through? And can I say the word fully anymore after that paragraph? So in Turn My Mourning into Dancing, Henry Nouwen says, whenever I choose other gods by making people or events the source of my joy, I find my sorrow only increases. When I demand from others what only God can give, I experience pain. The deepest joys come not from the money we earn or the friends we surround ourselves with or the results we achieve. We are rather whom God made us to be in His infinite love. As long as we keep running around anxiously trying to affirm ourselves or be affirmed by others, we remain blind to one who has loved us first, dwells in our heart, and has formed our truest self. So what I want to say further to this is, while I did have a very small community of people who were present with me, it was God who met me 6 weeks before my mom died to prepare me to release her. I see this as one example of how the presence of Jesus brought a measure of joy in my sadness, because that night God met me at that campfire. I could feel my heart breaking, Carrie. But because it was God Himself who entered into my grief and prepared me, I was able to face it. When God is the source of my joy, I can loosen my hold on how others should or should not respond to my story and therefore be more present to my own. And if I can just name a second tension as we learn to notice our own individual grieving in relationship to others. Carrie, sometimes I got it wrong. And I don't say this from a place of shaming myself. Like, how often do you go through a cancer journey where your mom might die? But in my lifetime journey of pushing down my emotions and telling myself I need to put others first and actually being told I need to put others first, how I got it wrong was that even though God prepared me for my mom's death, it didn't follow that I always managed my emotions well. The day my family were at the church preparing for my mom's celebration of life, it was a great kind of time together. We played music. We had a lot of fun together. Well, of course, being present to the fact that this was, a celebration of life service we were preparing for. I recognized that over time, that as we were preparing, that this drive within me for my mom's service to be exceptional started to take over. I actually strongly dislike the word perfect based on our human definitions. I would not generally describe myself as a perfectionistic human, but I did see that this tendency can show up in my life sometimes. So as the setup was going on, I started to notice that I wasn't responding very kindly to some of my siblings. They would come up with their ideas, and of course, this was their mom they were trying to honor. But I noticed that I was starting to say, no, it has to be this way. And I got to a point where one of my brother-in-laws came to me and said, very gently, hey, Liz, why don't you and I get out of here to get some of the stuff needed for tomorrow's service? After we left, I said something along the lines of, oh, I was starting to get agitated, wasn't I? Is that why you're taking me away for this drive? I remember some of my siblings' faces looking surprised because it's generally not my tendency to speak unkindly to others. And it's not that my brother-in-law was telling me I couldn't be upset, but I wasn't the only one who was feeling what I was feeling that day. I can be sad, upset, whatever it is, and there's a way to express emotions without trumping other people's. My intention wasn't to be unkind, but it was happening. I can feel what I feel, but it never follows that other people have to make room only for me. So this is a tension of sitting with my own stuff while entering into the stories of others. It's not all or nothing. Hey, Carrie, it's a both and.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Liz. Those examples just give us the great example of that tension and how grief can be something so individual.
Yeah.
It typically is something people experience for the most part in isolation, being the only person, family, or community connected to the one who has passed or a particular circumstance of loss. Liz, what strikes me is that in your journey with individual grief, you came to a place where you were able to enter into someone else's grief. What are some of the ways that your own individual experience of grief can expand to include others? And does this help us to feel joy even in the sadness?
Oh gosh, it's such a good question, Carrie. And when you first asked me this when we were preparing, the verse which jumped to mind, which is a good grounding verse in this journey, is John 1:14, which says, "The Word became flesh." And the Word is God come in human flesh through Jesus. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. So God vulnerably entered into this dark world to live among us. And Jesus lived in the rhythms of the Father, withdrawing to those lonely places we've talked about in an earlier episode for communion, but also entering into community with humans. Again, it's both and. So I knew the same God who was holding me was holding my mom in her community, and I witnessed firsthand some of that care. About 3 weeks after my mom's diagnosis in 2008, I was encouraged by many people to go home to Ontario to see her. And so for a weekend in November, I went home and surprised both my mom and my dad. Visiting my mom in the hospital was such an interesting experience because I noticed my mom was in relatively high spirits, and I was not expecting that. It was good to see her, and I noticed that she had this very consistent influx of visitors coming and going. Gradually, as the day progressed, I started to experience this measure of jealousy, Carrie, for time, as I was only home for a couple of days. I just went home for a weekend. But what I recognized later, the gift, to answer your question, is that what was so good to witness was that God was showing me, hey, look, Liz, your mom is more than okay. She's being held by friends and relatives and neighbors and medical staff. I just want you to be present to her. You don't need to control or fix anything. Just be her daughter right now. And that gave me a lot of comfort as I went back to Calgary a couple days later. Witnessing people hold up my mom and my family through visits, helping her figure out a new food diet, which would help her body grow in strength as her body also fought cancer, sending flowers and cards and making meals for my family showed me that collective grief isn't just coming together to mourn through tears and lament. It's also recognizing there were people who were in a position to help lift my mom's arms up, so to speak, when she was weak, while also witnessing my mom lift up the arms of others through her faith and courage. When we allow ourselves to remain covered by our grief alone, we can rob ourselves of the gift of giving and receiving light in the darkness. This happens when we choose to find our total identity in our grief and pain and suffering alone. Something I want to say out loud, Carrie, and this might even connect with you because of your journey, is my mom wasn't cancer. She was a human being, beloved of God and her community. Yes, she struggled in the darkness like any of us would. She was definitely no superhuman, and I don't mean that to disrespect her. She cried out to God, expressed her doubts and her fears about death, missing out on her grandkids that would grow up. But I would say those last few years of her life, I saw a transformation in my mom. I saw a woman who developed a deep, intimate friendship with God. She didn't allow her cancer to dictate her story. She didn't allow her grief, depression, and pain to swallow the light. That weekend I just shared, Carrie, this weekend I went home. She was in a semi-private room. I just want to share this story about her. Although she did have a steady stream of visitors from the Friday to Sunday I was there was a brief time she and I were alone on her side of the hospital room. Mom asked me to help her to the bathroom, but was able to be in there alone, so I just had to wait outside the washroom. Her hospital roommate and I looked at each other. I smiled in greeting, and she, in her very weak physical state, gruffly asked me, "What's your mom in here for?" I gently laughed and responded, "Oh, you make it seem like you're both in prison." And then she said, "Well, hospitals can feel like prison." Fair enough. My name is Liz. What's yours? Mrs. Stewart. I noticed since your mom and I have been in this room together, she's had a lot of visitors and prays a lot. I looked down at that moment and noticed Mrs. Stewart was tightly clutching a rosary and was curious about her own faith journey. I sensed she was clutching to something and was desperate for light in her own story. She said, "Your mom prays like she knows God personally. I don't get much visitors except for my son, so could I ask you for a favor? When your mom prays, could you ask her to include me in her prayers? Maybe God will hear her speak on my behalf." "Oh, of course I can do that. And we don't even have to wait for my mom. I can pray for you right now." I don't remember what I prayed over Mrs. Stewart, but when I finished, I noticed Mom had come out of the washroom and was smiling. I introduced them to one another and said, maybe you'll become friends. So eventually I flew back to Calgary at the end of that weekend, and over the next few weeks I stayed in touch with Mom. In one of our conversations, Mom let me know she and Mrs. Stewart had many conversations, and Mrs. Stewart made a choice to believe Jesus is who he said he would be. And just a few weeks before Christmas, my mom had been released from the hospital and contacted me to let me know she had found out through Mrs. Stewart's son that she had died. I actually do think about that story from time to time, Carrie, and think how easy it would have been for a mom who was human to identify solely with her cancer and her grief alone and allow the darkness to swallow the life and light within her. She was in great pain, physically, mentally, emotionally. It was sometimes very honest about that, which I'm grateful for. But even so, more often than not, she chose to walk in light, and that light was a beacon for others who were walking a similar path. And that light is what led Mrs. Stewart to walk in light too. My mom did mourn her cancer journey, but she did not mourn as someone who had no hope.
Liz, that's really beautiful.
Well, and I know, Carrie, I've been sharing a lot about my mom's journey, and you're going to get your turn. But can I say that in keeping with our theme today of welcoming grief, may I share how joy entered into darkness on what could easily be seen as the darkest day of my family's life?
Yes, Liz, please.
So I just wanted to share a bit of my experience of what it was like to witness what would be considered both a sacred moment and a really hard moment in my life. On September 6, 2011, I was a youth pastor and was working in the office that morning when my dad called me up and said, Liz, I'm just calling to let you know that the doctors just let me know that your mom's time is coming soon. And so we had a very brief conversation, and he said to me, you do with this information what you will, but no pressure to come home if you're not able to. All that to say, I hung up the phone, and in a moment, all I could say was, okay, God, we're doing this. I got out of my chair. I walked past the two male coworkers I was working with. I said, guys, I know we have youth tomorrow night, and it's our kickoff, but I don't think I'm going to be able to make it because I think my mom is dying. I need to get home right now. And there was that urgency within me, Carrie. I didn't even wait for the response. I just beelined it to the receptionist, who was a friend of mine. And I said, hey, friend, my mom is going to pass away soon. I just need to let you know that I'm not going to be in the office. I don't know how long. She stood up, Carrie, and just enveloped me in this hug and just cried. I was not quite there. I was in this, like, we need to get this done kind of mode. So I was so grateful for that hug. And she's like, Liz, I'm going to book your flight for you. Another staff heard her say this. She's like, I'm going to pay for your flight. And then I just got in my car, went home, packed. And another coworker told me, Liz, I'll pick you up at your house so you can leave your car at your place. So after my friend dropped me off at the airport, she handed me an envelope and said, we're praying for you. We're thinking of you, Liz, and just kind of blessed me before I got on the plane. So I landed pretty late. It was probably like well after midnight, and I stayed up with my siblings who were still awake and just looked shell-shocked. There was just this moment of people not knowing what to do. And so eventually we all went to bed. It was probably after 2:00. And then I woke up at 7 with just having a few hours of sleep. And I was like, I need to get to the hospice now, as my mom had been transferred to the hospice the week before. And so my dad, who had been in this for, a long time, he's like, Liz, we're good. Let's just take some time. I was like, no, Dad, we got to get there now. And eventually we got there at about 10:30. And a couple of my brothers were there with my dad and I. And it was this beautiful moment where I walked into the hospice room. I was quite shocked to see the state of my mom at that point, because even though she was alive, she wasn't like alert the same way. Like it was like she couldn't really interact except look at us, breathing very, very heavily. So over time, I recognized, oh, what was in that envelope? And I noticed the staff had actually taken up like an offering, in a sense, like a love offering is what often people would call it. And it was quite a sizable amount, which actually went to a lot of the details surrounding my mom's death. But I also went and treated my brothers to a lunch, and then eventually told my dad, you need to go down and get some food too, because you need to sustain yourself too. So while my dad was down getting soup in the cafeteria at the hospice, I was with my two brothers, and we were both just rubbing my mom's feet and her hand. And this amazing nurse would come in and check on us periodically. At one point, as I was rubbing my mom's hand, I said to her, I was like, oh, I'm rubbing my mom's hands, but they keep getting colder. And she just put her hand on my shoulder and said, Liz, I just want you to know it's time. And I was like, you mean like in the next day? She's like, no, it's time. And so I said to her, I was like, I need to go get my dad. He has to be here. And I was about to rush out. And she said, no, you stay, you stay. She went to the elevator, and perfect timing, my dad was just coming off the elevator. I'd been sitting in a chair beside my mom. So when my dad came in, I said, why don't you sit here with mom? I went to the head of the bed. And so we were kind of positioned this way. And this doctor came in and stood by my mom's head and said, okay, and checked her pulse. And at that moment, as my dad was holding my mom's hand, the doctor declared 2:15, which was the time my mom passed away. And my dad took a breath and then burst into tears. I burst into tears, and I just enveloped him in a hug. And we just had this sacred moment where he was just my dad's kind of an overdrive guy too, where he was like, I need to call everyone, let them know. And I said to him, no, Dad, just take this moment in. I think we just need a moment to just take this news in right now. And we just cried and let ourselves feel that moment. Mm-hmm. And Carrie, I share this example because when I look back on that moment, I've had a few people say, oh, Liz, I don't know if I could be there seeing someone die in front of me. And yes, would I want to do this every day? No, I would not. But I'm so grateful I could be there to witness this sacred moment between my dad and myself, my dad and my mom holding her hand as she breathed her last breath, my two brothers. There was something weirdly beautiful about that. And so I listed a few gifts in grief. I listed a friend hugging me, staff paying for this unexpected trip that I did not budget for, just a lot of beautiful gifts. And so I'm not trying to summarize my mom's death in this neat little way with a pretty little bow, Carrie, but this is just one example of how light can break into darkness.
Oh, Liz, thank you for your vulnerability. It is such a difficult space, and yet you've named the beauty and some of the spaces of joy, the gifts.
Yeah, so and one big one I will name just briefly. So I said my dad called me on September 6, 2011.
Right.
That was my oldest sister's birthday. Oh. And the fact that my mom died on September 7th, 2011, for me, it sounds like a little detail, but I'm so glad my sister has her own birthday and she's not having to share it with the day of my mom's death.
Oh, amen.
That's a kindness of God.
Very much. And your story really reminded me of the ways and the people that provided a great deal of healing for me and my family as well around my brother's death. In particular, his friends who stayed by his side in the hospital and continued to stay by my side and that of my family, even to this day. That connection with my brother's friends has brought an immense sense of joy and peace into our lives as we see my brother's life lived on through them, knowing he'll never be forgotten, always close to our hearts and in our minds. The collective suffering, the collective grief that you name, also just so important. And I think it's something we've all been experiencing actually as part of the pandemic.
Yeah, for sure.
For the past 2.5 years, there's been a global awareness of the loss experienced by so many and the ongoing loss of life, resources, and sense of normalcy. It's been disorienting, uncomfortable, confusing, exhausting. Yeah. And I think in many ways, we are still very much living in a grieving world.
Yes, Carrie. You just brought grief to this global level. What does this tell us? There's no human on the planet who has escaped pain. In grief therapy, I help individual clients name their unique experience of loss, whatever that might be. However, I also work with them to look outside of themselves to help them connect their stories with others. You said earlier that joy doesn't necessarily come easy and has to be cultivated. You referenced Brené Brown's definition of foreboding joy. And I sense, Carrie, there was a reason for that. What about her definition stood out to you?
Yes, Liz. This foreboding joy hits very close to home. And when I first read it, I was actually so relieved to know I was not alone in this feeling. As I've shared in our previous episodes, over the past 2 years, I've been on a cancer journey, and in this space have often been gripped by anxiety and worry, often finding it hard from what felt like a place of survival to see beauty, joy, and the blessings that have been and continue to be here. Thankfully, as I've moved farther away from that initial diagnosis and the surgeries and treatments, many of these worries only pop up from time to time and not on a moment-by-moment basis as they used to. Yet, of all the worries that plague me, there is still one that is constant and without ceasing. And I've started to recognize that this worry continues to steal my joy. In fact, it's still hard to say out loud without getting emotional. But my constant worry is the fear of no longer being here to be a mother to my children. This is the fear, the worry, the sadness that I feel at my core. And I think what makes this particular fear still unsettled is that I'm living in 6-month cycles. I have routine checkups approximately every 6 months. And some of that is also me initiating tests as I get used to this new body and wonder about every ache and pain. But each time there's a pain, a test, a doctor's appointment, a lot of these fears come flooding back. But the one about my daughters and my family most prominently. Will this be the last birthday, anniversary, Christmas? Liz, will I be the empty seat at the table?
There's a question.
And today, at 2 years and 5 months, I find myself in that place again. This week, I begin a series of tests as my doctors continue to monitor my health. And although for the most part I feel well and haven't been in that dark and scary space for what feels like quite a while, these new rounds of tests have been very triggering. Liz, in very real time, I'm living this tension of being joyful. I actually love the Christmas season. I'm grateful for this day. I'm grateful for you and our podcast adventure. I'm grateful for my family, friends, and the abundance of blessings in my life. Yet, there is a real, almost paralyzing fear about the unknowns that lie ahead. Perhaps most surprising to me is that I'm here sitting and talking about this with you in real time, in this safe place. So thank you for that. But this is how I sense there's been a shift, even if ever so small, a loosening of my grip, an acceptance of God's ways, even when I don't understand them or they don't line up with my own. A little bit more trust that even in this dark place where I can feel so weak, it's not my strength or my joy that I rely on or even need to cultivate.
Yeah.
I read a really beautiful devotional last week on Psalm 62, verse 11, where God said to me, "All the strength and power you need flows from me." Oh, that just allowed me to take a breath. And as we talk about joy, I'm also reminded of the beautiful story in the Bible's book of Nehemiah, where God's people are grieving and are in need of comfort, and God gives them these words, "The joy of the Lord is my strength." Now, of course, these words don't suddenly take away the fears, but I do grab onto them with all my might, saying them sometimes many times a day, especially when I feel burdened by the thoughts that steal my joy and strength. My prayer is that God would instill this truth deeply in my heart and in my soul, because joy is outside of our circumstances, and sometimes so too is the ability to cultivate it. It's not our own, but the joy and strength of the Lord that enables us to experience this emotion in a way that is consistent, cultivated internally, a joy that has to do with the state of our spirit, our heart, and our soul, a joy that's real, everlasting, and eternal.
Amen. Carrie, thank you. So beautifully complicated. And so just beautiful how you said, I love that you said that verse from Psalm 62:11, where God said to you, all the strength and power you need, Carrie, flows from me, from God. And you said that inviting me to take a breath. It's like if you can just take the breath, that is one beautiful example of choosing light over in the midst of the darkness. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. The joy of the Lord is my strength. The joy of the Lord is our strength. What I would like to do is to invite our listeners into a simple practice that you can actually do any time of the year. But there's something really beautiful about this idea of Advent, light coming into darkness. So what I just call the spiritual practice, bringing light into darkness. About 5 years ago, I was with some friends in the famous Christmas store in Banff, Alberta. I had no intention to buy anything. I was just looking around when I came across what would be considered the religious section of baby Jesuses and angels. And also this one small section of ornaments dedicated to those who have died. Picking up this one ornament, it was this old vintage looking candle. This candle read, "A candle burns in memory of those who have gone before us." Something within me felt it was one simple way to honor the short 59 years Mom walked this earth, as Christmas was one of her favorite times of year. Most of the year, this ornament is hidden away in my Christmas bins unseen. But as I was preparing for this episode, I was thinking about this idea this week, recognizing all the losses I've experienced throughout my life, whether it's been relationships or job losses. These losses have often brought up emotions and thoughts I would prefer to remain just that, like unseen and hidden, like this ornament in this Christmas bin. I can't see my mom right now. Carrie can't see her brother right now. But even though their memories are very much alive among those of us who've had the privilege of knowing them and being influenced by them, we know that they are not physically here. There's a hiddenness. Where she once sat at our dinner table, there sits an empty chair. And where your brother once sat at the dinner table, there sits an empty chair. So something I want to invite us to consider doing this Advent Christmas season, or any time of the year you're listening to this, is rather than hiding from our losses, perhaps what you can do is light a candle to represent the loss or losses you have experienced, or pull up an empty chair to your table. This chair and candle can be representative of a person, but maybe like Carrie, you would look at this exercise and think, oh my goodness, maybe I'll be in that empty chair. What I'd like us to do as we consider the different losses, whatever you've gone through, whether it's a job loss, a relationship, whatever it is, what I want you to do is feel free to pray this prayer over that space. God, we invite you into this space. We invite you to fill this empty chair with your presence of peace, your presence of joy. We invite you to also take our anxiety and our fears that we have and fill that empty chair with your presence of peace, your presence of joy. We want to still honor the loss of the one we love or the losses that we have experienced, but we want to choose to not mourn as those who have no hope. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome. In closing, I would very much love to speak over each of you and over families, over communities, the priestly blessing found in the book of Numbers, chapter 6, verses 24 to 26. Wherever you are this Advent and Christmas season, whether seated alone or surrounded by people, whether sitting in a hospital room or working the overnight shift, whether you're in a time of mourning or a time of dancing, weeping or rejoicing, may the Lord bless you and may the Lord keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you his peace. Amen.
Amen.